late 80s, early 90s, and we have a lot of really fantastic research going on there right now, which is why we were excited to be able to be part of a Science Cafe series here at the garden. And I'm going to give you an overview of the facility, a little bit of the history and background, and just give you little teasers about some of the different projects that we're working on. And then over the next 3 months, we will have people come and actually talk to you about the specifics. And so Biosphere 2 was built to replicate Biosphere 1. I will kick off the series on the hottest of the 4 days. And you know, I think you can't rule out the impact of climate change, one of the things that we study at Biosphere 2. Right? Hottest August on record, and I think there were only 3 or 4 days that were below average last month. And at the Desert Museum, where I also spent some time, they had to reduce the length of the season for their Raptor free flight program because it was too hot in April at the end of the season. They had to stop it earlier. So the title's coming up. Tonight I'm going to talk sort of big picture, and then we've got Changing Landscapes from the Ground Up, which is our Landscape Evolution Observatory, which I will introduce you to. And then we have a 700,000-gallon ocean that we use for research, and Dr. Diane Thompson will come talk to you about that. And then we have a tropical rainforest in the desert, and we're doing some really neat research there, and Dr. Laura Meredith will come and talk to you about that work. So the U of A has been managing the Biosphere 2 facility not for 10 years, but for 12 years. But with a 2, you can't make that cool little globe symbol. So I'm still using this. But 2007, the U of A started managing. 2011, we were gifted the facility. And in 2017, after the first 10 years, the owner of the land and the facility, and the guy who spent money to build it, gave us an endowment on top of gifting us the facility, which is really quite generous. If you've ever done anything with an endowment, right, for example, this one goes to the U of A Foundation, and we're allowed to use about 4 or 4.5% of the proceeds. So 30 million sounds like a lot, but it's actually just over $1 million a year, which is less than what Ed Bass was giving us annually for the 10 years prior to that, which was 3 to 4 million. So we've had to tighten our belt a little bit, and we've also gotten more investment from the university, which is great. We had a little bit of a branding conversation a couple years ago trying to figure out how do we communicate to people what Biosphere 2 is, right? Not some freaky relic in the desert. That's not what we're going for. That wasn't the branding that we chose. But it really is a laboratory where we can do experiments about how the planet works, and the things that we study are things that matter to all of us, right? So this is sort of the 3-point branding exercise. A little context for why I'm up here. I grew up in Tucson. I was moved here when I was 2. I went to the U of A. I studied ecology and economics. I thought you could save the world if you knew both those disciplines. But I got frustrated by sort of that third rail of policy and politics where decisions sometimes are not made based on evidence from any realm. And so I went sort of harder into the sciences after that. I've taught a number of different things at the university, including a number of field courses, including courses in the Galapagos. Reptiles and amphibians are my favorite creatures, and I got into sort of this outreach approach to talking about science because it's not too difficult to captivate a room with a Gila monster or a rattlesnake, right? People they're present, right? They know what's going on when they hear ch-ch-ch-ch. And some of them are like, oh, that's the coolest thing, I want to go see it. And other folks are like, where's the door? But they remember. I met my wife in Wisconsin where the weather was different, and then I was able to drag her back here. So Biosphere 2 now serves several sort of simultaneous roles. Primarily it's a research facility, and that's what I'm going to tell you more about today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the educational programming that we have the opportunity to do there. And as Aaron mentioned, we reach at least 110,000 people or so each year, and more when you include our website and some of our online offerings. And then when Columbia University was there, they invested a lot of money in building what we call our Casita Village. They basically built dormitories for students from Columbia, from the East Coast, that would come out here and effectively be doing study abroad. Right? This was a different world for them. And Columbia pulled out of their participation at Biosphere 2 in the mid-2000s, the president of Columbia changed, and they had just a change in priorities. They wanted to spend money closer to home and not out here in the desert. So thankfully, we have this casita village that has 100 sleeping rooms in 28 casitas, each with its own kitchen for 3 to 5 bedrooms, etc. It's really a nice place to have conferences and retreats and for students to come stay. When the new president of the university came on, I think he probably wanted to be able to talk about how good our football team was. But he also saw the value of a bunch of the science that we do. Right? And he also noted that Biosphere 2 is something that nobody else has. How can we take advantage of that? How can we leverage that in order to improve the quality of our research, improve the quality of our instruction, recruit better faculty, recruit better students, all those sorts of things. So that's a little bit of an intro to the U of A's start at Biosphere 2. Well, let's go back in time a little bit and talk about why Biosphere 2 was built in the first place. So this is planet Earth, one of these iconic pictures taken from space. And actually some of the pictures, if you don't know this already, you can learn a lot about it, but the pictures of the moon that were used for the Apollo missions, figuring out where to land, those were taken by folks at the U of A. We've had a really strong track record in space sciences for a long time. But a lot of folks wanted to know if we could replicate the way the Earth works in a smaller enclosed system, right? And you could try that here on Earth, which is what Biosphere 2 is, and maybe what you're trying to do is prepare for some sort of space exploration or some sort of ability to live someplace that's inhospitable. Antarctica comes to mind, for example. And so there were a lot of folks talking and thinking about this, and they were able to, in the context of conversations about environmental health and how the planet functions, observations by folks like Rachel Carson, who were noting that when you put pesticides and other things into the environment, they don't just disappear. They actually bioaccumulate and become really nasty things that can cause cancer, etc. And so some of the greatest legislation, in my opinion, that the U.S. has passed happened in the early 70s, signed by Nixon, right? Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. Pretty impressive stuff that at the time was sort of a bipartisan no-brainer. How do we keep ourselves healthy, right? So the folks that got together and found the funding to build Biosphere 2, they were having all these conversations for several decades prior. And then they found this piece of land near Oracle that was for sale. They wanted a place with lots of sunshine and without seismic activity, right? They wanted to build something that was going to last and have enough energy coming in to be the base of the ecosystem food chain. So construction took about 4 years, which for building something totally unique that's more than 3 acres in size is pretty amazing. And the sort of articulated budget is about $150 million. Most people think it was more like $250 million in the 80s and 90s, and it would be like $1 billion to build a facility like that today that was gifted to the U of A, right? So that's a pretty neat resource that we have. But when you drop $250 million into rural Arizona over the course of half a decade, some interesting things happen, right? And some of the things that were slated to become part of Biosphere 2 never quite made it to the property, right? And so there's some interesting stories of, for example, grates that were going to go into some cooling towers to keep people from falling to their death. There's no grates there because the grates ended up in Oracle in somebody's yard as a goat pen, right? So just some funny anecdotes along the way. In addition to trying to understand how the planet worked, people were also interested in trying to basically colonize the solar system, right? Do we know enough to be able to build bioregenerative systems that could keep people alive long-term somewhere else? So far, we haven't figured this out, right? When we put people up in a space station or a space shuttle or these various space missions that we do now, they're not growing their own food, right? All that food is sent up. We basically are at the point where we can grow lettuce enough to have basically a salad a week for 5 or 6 people. That's about where we're at. And part of the challenge is that once you try and do bioregenerative systems, there's a whole lot of viruses and microbes, bacteria, things that are also going to be part of that system, that once you have it in something that doesn't have the typical controls, they kind of go nuts, right? So my understanding from talking to folks that have been there, the space station smells absolutely horrible. You get used to it after a week, right? But it smells absolutely horrible because in all these nooks and crannies, there's all this stuff growing that you don't really want to have there. And they get occasional things like the water supply line, the fresh water supply line, the clean water, right? It'll get clogged up and they'll take it apart to clean it. And it's got basically, it looks like a snot plug that comes out of it. And it's a bacteria that has gotten in there, and that's a great habitat for it, right? So I think our challenge is trying to figure out how do we do sort of these bioregenerative systems without having all the other controls in place that all the other millions of species on the planet provide, right? Once you take things out of context, it gets very challenging. Maybe you saw The Martian, a fun movie, and basically he was trying to do what fundamentally is going to have to happen, right? How do you produce enough food to live somewhere else? How do you terraform? How do you take Martian soil and provide the nutrients, the temperature conditions, and the water that you need to grow food? Right? Where did Matt Damon get his nutrients?
Yams.
Poo. His departed astronaut's freeze-dried poo. That's right. And smartly, he plugged his nose while he was mixing that stuff all up, right? What else did he spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to do?
Eat it.
Temperature regulation. Exactly. One more key one.
Water.
Water. Okay, two more key ones. Three more key ones. Light. Good. And there's no way he had enough light in the system that he had to do this. He just didn't have enough lumens, enough waters going on. One more thing. The plants will actually produce oxygen in photosynthesis. So you need actually
CO2.
carbon dioxide, right? Carbon dioxide. They also use oxygen, but they need carbon dioxide to do photosynthesis. So I think these kinds of conversations get us into the territory where we can sort of think about why do we care about Earth systems? Well, because they provide absolutely everything for us, right? We would not be here, none of us, none of the species would be here if this planet wasn't the right distance from the sun, water-based, or at a temperature where water is mostly liquid, carbon-based life forms, etc. And a key component of these conversations, one that comes up often, in part because it is changing, is climate. So what are the main drivers of climate?
Gases. Atmosphere.
Sun, yes. So sun is going to be bigger than the two I'm actually looking for. So given that you have a sun and you have an Earth that is doing this, right? What are the two things that determine, say, what plant community lives on the other side of that wall? Okay.
Precipitation.
Temperature and
Precipitation.
precipitation.
Yeah.
Temperature and precipitation. Okay, those are the two. And latitude is correlated with those, right? Latitude is going to drive what you see. Elevation is correlated with that, right? So down here, it's hot, and we get maybe on average 11 inches of rain. You go to the top of Mount Lemmon, is the temperature warmer or cooler?
Cooler.
Cooler. And anybody know how much rain falls up there?
Much more.
It's like 30 inches.
Yeah.
Okay? That's a different world up there. And guess what? The vegetation is different. So some of the questions that we can ask and answer about Biosphere 2 have to do with what's going to happen as climate changes. And I think, there's been people talking about this for many, many decades. The impacts of burning fossil fuels and increasing CO2 in the atmosphere was correctly predicted in the late 1800s, more accurate models in the 1950s, right? And somehow as a society or as a species, we've collectively sort of stuck our head in the sand. And now we're starting to see the implications, right? So what are a couple of things in the news right now that are correlated with a change in climate?
More extreme weather events.
More extreme weather events, right? So parts of the Bahamas are pretty much gone. And it's not that climate change is causing hurricanes to form. It's that as the temperature of the ocean warms up, you've got more energy, and therefore you've got storms that are stronger and drop more precipitation. Okay? What's another big one in the news?
Fires.
Fires, especially in the Amazon, right? And the Amazon basin produces more oxygen than any other terrestrial environment on the planet. When you look at the ocean and the fact that it's 70% of the Earth's surface, there's actually more oxygen produced by all the little things that do photosynthesis in the surface of the ocean. But on a per meter basis, the forest is way more productive, right? I hope that people are starting to care. It's starting to get expensive for us, right? I can go on, if you want the 3-hour rant about the political implications here, I'm happy to go there afterwards when Aaron turns the camera off. So what are the kinds of things that this all brings us to care about? Well, energy is a big one, right? Somebody mentioned sun as the principal driver of climate. That's exactly right. And the things that we've changed are things like CO2, which changes the amount of energy you trap, and therefore changes temperature, precipitation, weather patterns. The molecules, right? So for all intents and purposes, on the time scale of humans, this is a closed system, right? There's no new things coming in. We just recycle everything, right? So trying to explain to my 13-year-old came home and was telling me all about how she learned about atoms. I was like, well, that's pretty cool. And then the 10-year-old was like, what? And so then trying to explain to her that, she's probably breathing in something that used to be part of a Tyrannosaurus rex, and kind of blew her mind. And then the key one is water, right? What's the limiting factor in our environment? It's water, right? You add water, you get life, you get growth, and if you add enough water consistently, you get a different ecosystem. If we talk more specifically about the things that we care about, right? All our food is coming from this planet. I think a lot of people don't understand that anymore. They think it comes in a box on the shelf at the store, right? And they get really weirded out when you talk about, well, to eat chicken, you got to kill a chicken, right? Carbon, oxygen, all these things that we need, we value, and that sometimes we don't pay for. So understanding how those things move around, how you can control them, how you might be able to predict what they're going to do, was part of the objectives in the early 90s. You can see the labels on some of the different parts of this 3-acre Biosphere 2. Intensive agriculture was about a half-acre area where they were going to try and grow all the food that they needed. This is entry day in September of '91, when 8 people went inside, 4 men and 4 women. And had they done a little more research on the psychology of group dynamics, they would have realized that 8 quickly becomes 2 very strong factions of 4 that hate each other, right? And that happened by week 3. So there's a whole lot of interesting social science that didn't get well studied. If you want a 19-minute investment into sort of what happened inside Biosphere 2, I highly recommend Jane Pointer's TED Talk. It's a lot of fun. She was a great speaker. If you look at the layout of the facility, up top there you have the living quarters and the laboratories, apartments, kitchen, those sorts of things. And then the sort of big white square there that looks like it's got a road going through the middle of it. It's not a road, but that is where the agricultural food production was happening. And then this axis along here was where they were trying within one building to have very, very different ecosystem types. So we've got a rainforest, we've got a couple different kinds of savanna, we've got a mangrove marsh, we've got a coastal fog desert, and we've got a 700,000-gallon ocean. Right? Pretty ambitious to try and put those all under one roof and get them to persist. And they have for about 3 decades. So all that stuff under one roof in order to be able to grow enough food. So that's a picture of that agricultural area. To have the mangrove marsh, to have the desert biome, to have the rainforest, to support the ocean, and to be able to support people and provide them the latest in 1980s furnishings. Right? We still keep one apartment as it was, and it's got a really nice sort of 1989 boom box on the shelf. But this is tough, right? How do you do this? you have to think of a lot of different things because you can't just take advantage of the things that nature sort of provides for free, right? So underneath this 3-acre Biosphere 2 is 2 acres of infrastructure, right? So this is some drone footage in some of the biomes, and then what I want to get to is the fact that then the footage moves underneath. And you'll see that to support these different life zones up top, you basically have to recreate nature, right? You have to move air, you have to move humidity, you have to create rainfall, you have to thermoregulate, right? When they initially started this whole project, they wanted to be not only materially closed, but also completely energy self-sufficient. They wanted it to be solar powered. And my understanding of the calculations that they did, they were going to need like 30 acres of solar panels, right? If you think about trying to keep 3 acres of greenhouse cool in Arizona in June, it takes a lot of energy. So they quickly gave up on sustainable energy and went to sort of a Earth model in the sense that materially closed, but as much energy as they wanted, they would get from outside. So it's hooked up to the electrical grid, backup diesel generator, backup natural gas generator. Because if you lost your connection to the grid, you're going to cook everything inside in June in half an hour if you don't have a way to keep things cool, right? So you had to have some redundancy built in. And they spent $1 million a year on energy in the early 90s. It's a lot of money, right? We don't keep the building sealed anymore. We let the hottest air escape out of the top. And we've been able to cut our budget, and I'm not adjusting for inflation, cut our budget down to about $500,000 for energy consumption. Just still a lot of money, right? But it's not $1 million in 1990 dollars. So I harp on this part because I think Biosphere 2 is a great way to introduce folks to the concept of nature services or ecosystem services. This is the things that we get from the natural world that we value, but sometimes we don't pay for, right? So the fact that we're breathing oxygen is because the photosynthesis happening in the plants and the algae are providing the oxygen, right? Until photosynthesis evolved, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. So we would not be here if photosynthesis hadn't evolved 1 billion years ago. What is this little photo depicting? What kind of ecosystem service?
Pollination.
Pollination.
Yep.
Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of things that are pollinated by insects and birds, and about half of the foods that we eat are insect pollinated. If you were to lose those insect pollinators and hire people to go out with a paintbrush and take pollen from one flower to the next flower in order to fertilize it, what do you think happens to the price of your food? Through the roof, right? Through the roof. Clean water, wave action. I mean, everything that is the basis of our economy is at some point an ecosystem service that the planet provides for us, right? Sometimes we value them explicitly, right? We have a dollar amount that we put on, say, timber that's coming out of a forest. But we don't put a dollar value on how much local bees pollinate the plants in our yard or the plants at a botanical garden, right? Maybe these folks actually do. They might actually have some idea what that value is. So what was the main thing that these folks were trying to get to work well? Food and oxygen, right? And this has both. You are able to grow your different food crops, and at the same time you're producing oxygen because that's a byproduct of photosynthesis. Okay? Didn't work quite as well as they wanted it to. And there's 2 primary reasons leading to 2 outcomes. Okay? The 2 outcomes are that the oxygen level dropped from close to 21%, which is what it is around us right now, down to about 14%, which is basically like trying to live halfway up the side of a mountain. Okay? You are uncomfortable when oxygen is at 14%. And they didn't grow enough calories. So Dr. Walford, one of the 8 people, the oldest of the 8, and an actual physician, they all lost a ton of weight, right? And they were keeping track of how they were doing. And they were eating like 1,700 calories a day and burning like 2,200 calories a day. Right? They were a bunch of hardworking vegetarians. the two reasons, one is sort of, I think, nature fighting back, if you will, and the other is sort of an engineering oversight. So this is a picture of the Pacific during an El Nino year. And during an El Nino year, the winds that move from east to west across the Pacific stop. And so you don't get the conveyor belt of water in the Pacific that brings cold water up along the coast of the Americas. Instead, you get warm water sitting there on the surface, and that generates a lot more storms and rainfall in the Americas. So in an El Nino year, we tend to get above average rainfall, right? That happens all along the Americas. And it's called El Nino because you can detect an increase in ocean temperature in December, November, December, just before Christmas. El Nino is for the Christ child, right, in Spanish. And the fishermen would be able to predict, okay, this coming year is going to be an El Nino year because the ocean is warm going into Christmas time. And when this happens, you have more cloud cover than average over Biosphere 2 in southern Arizona. So what happens to the incident sunlight that's going to power photosynthesis? It goes down, right? So they didn't have as much energy coming in as they expected. The other part of the story, equally interesting, but a different origin, it is a combination of very rich soil that was put into these biomes, especially in the rainforest. About 4 meters worth of soil in the rainforest. And a number of the nutrients were provided by dredging cattle tanks not far from Oregon, right? If you've ever spent time at a cattle tank, you know what's in there? Sometimes water, and if there's water, there's cows and cow prints and a lot of cow poop, right? They're pretty nasty places. So there was a ton of nutrients and a ton of microbes, way more nutrients than the plants could take up. So the microbes were like, what do you mean? We're getting rained on consistently all the time? We get to be at a constant temperature? We are the happiest microbes ever, right? So they went absolutely nuts. And they were consistently pulling oxygen out of the atmosphere and producing carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide, it actually went up to 5,000 parts per million, right? Around us right now, it's about 400, a little above 400. 5,000 starts to get dangerous. But it would have gone much, much higher if they hadn't neglected to cure or seal the concrete throughout the building. So the concrete that was curing was absorbing carbon dioxide. And CO2, every time a carbon dioxide molecule got stuck in that concrete, it was taking oxygen as part of it, and therefore they were losing that chunk of their atmosphere. So those two things together dropped the oxygen concentration enough that it was uncomfortable, and they decided they either needed to open the doors at about day 500 of 2 years, or they needed to pump in some oxygen. And they did the latter. And I think this was sort of the death knell with respect to their relationship with the media. They did this sort of under cover of dark at night and tried to be secret about pumping oxygen in. That's not sort of the most transparent way to do science, right? But interesting story. But immediately, people started thinking, well, that's kind of cool. Look what's happening to our planet. Oxygen's not changing a whole lot, but CO2 sure as heck is. I wonder if this is a place where we could study the impacts of changing carbon dioxide levels. And so those were some of the first experiments that were done at Biosphere 2. Who knows why, although the whole thing keeps going up, every year there's a zig and a zag. So the northern hemisphere has more land area, and therefore more vegetation. And in the growing season in the northern hemisphere, you are taking CO2 out of the atmosphere a little bit faster than it's being put in there. And then in the non-growing season in the northern hemisphere, CO2 levels tend to go back up. So it's going down every growing season in the northern hemisphere, and then it's going back up during the non-growing season. But you can see that even though it does that every year, the pattern is clearly continuing to go up, right? What are fossil fuels? Just to drive home this point.
Oil.
Oil? What is?
Gas.
Did somebody say oil? With an extra syllable? That's how my dad would say it. He's from Texas. Yes, oil, but what is the oil made of?
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon.
Not carbon dioxide.
Carbon.
Carbon.
Yep.
What kind of carbon? Where's the carbon from?
Decay.
Ancient plant life. That's exactly right. So fossil fuels are an ecosystem service that has sort of been sequestered in the ground for 2, 3, 4, 500 million years, right? It is the product of photosynthesis that has then basically died and become buried and become oil, coal, natural gas, etc., right? And, you know, there's a normal carbon cycle at which carbon leaves the ocean or leaves the land, goes into the atmosphere, gets absorbed into plants die, go into the ground, etc. And what we've become very efficient at doing in the past 150 years is taking that fossil fuel out of the ground, right? So we have changed the carbon cycle dramatically, which is why there's an effect, right? That's why CO2 levels have gone up, because we've been able to pull out what took 500 million years to put down in about 200 years, right? Carbon dioxide experiments. So at Biosphere 2, and Columbia did some of this work when they were there for about 8 years. The ocean, if you increase CO2 in the atmosphere, more of it dissolves into water, and the water becomes more acidic. Okay. And we also, instead of growing vegetation in the agricultural area, grew trees and manipulated temperature, precipitation, and carbon dioxide, and looked at how the trees responded. And lots of really neat insights in the 90s that foreshadow some of the things that we're seeing out on the landscape today. When they did this work in the ocean, they were predicting that the change in pH would be damaging to the corals that were living in there. And that's exactly what they found. As you increase CO2, you decrease pH, and as you decrease pH, things that have to make hard parts, like corals that are making their skeletons, or snails, you know, other things that are basically taking elements out of the environment and making some sort of a shell, it gets harder and harder to do that. And if you make it acidic enough, these things actually start to dissolve. And so they tweaked the ocean enough there that they killed off all the corals. And I'll come back to that in a second. But that was a pretty interesting finding. And part of the value of doing this in Biosphere 2 was it wasn't just one species in an isolated test tube or beaker, right? It wasn't a full-blown natural ecosystem, but it was something much more complex than you typically find in a laboratory setting. So there's some complexity and multiple variables that could be addressed. And so this is when people thought, you know what, this is actually a pretty useful tool for understanding how the planet works. Let's argue that this is kind of like these multi-billion-dollar projects that people build to study physics, where they smash atoms together, right? Under Switzerland. Or like these multi-million-dollar telescope projects. Right? This is a schematic of the Giant Magellan telescope. The biggest mirrors for telescopes in the world, guess where they're made?
Mirror Lab.
U of A football stadium.
That's right.
Exactly right. So coming back to the football joke, if you will. So Joaquin Ruiz, who runs the College of Science, and Aaron and I both work for him, his joke is that the best thing to come out of the U of A football stadium is science. On one side, it's telescope mirrors. On the other side, for many, many decades, it was tree ring science. And obviously, we spend a lot of money doing things like going to asteroids and bringing back samples. And this is exciting and very valuable and cool, but I wish we could spend that kind of money understanding our own planet. We haven't yet gotten people to give us the kind of dollars at Biosphere 2 that people get to go to Bennu. But we're working on it. Because there's a lot of questions that we still need to figure out, right? And we all depend on figuring out the answers to those questions and or mitigating the changes to these systems. So some of the challenges have to do with the interactions of time and space. A big one is sort of what happens at this biology, physical sciences divide, right? CO2 is not alive, but then when in photosynthesis it becomes a sugar, right now it's part of a biological organism. There's all sorts of transfers like that where things are going between living and non-living systems. We know that the planet is warming up. These are actual measurements, not predictions, of changes in ocean temperature. And you can see that there is a lot more red on this map than there is blue. Okay. Land and ocean temperature departure 2016, based on a 30-year average, 1981 to 2010. And it's going to be even more extreme if you compared it to a, say, 1890 to 1920 average, right? We just have less data from that time period. It looks like the place to go move to, though, is kind of South America, right? So we do Earth system science. We have this billion-dollar facility. And why is it valuable? Because it is a combination of scale and control that you can't find anywhere else. Right? So if you look at this graph, you've got degree of control or manipulation on the y-axis, and you've got spatial or temporal scales on the x-axis. And if you are at small scale in the laboratory, like the test tube photo, then you can measure things very accurately, you can manipulate things very precisely, but you don't know what that means when you put it in the natural world, right? You can make some predictions, you can go out and try, but it's oversimplified, right? And then if you go down where I have the planet picture, right, you can study things out in nature, but there are so many variables that you can't control that sometimes it's hard to know what's driving what, right? So what's nice about Biosphere 2 is it lets us play with complicated systems at a scale where there is complexity, but with a level of control and measurement that's more akin to a laboratory. And so it helps us connect the dots between what people learn in laboratories and what people learn by observing nature. It also lets us sort of learn some things that we then say, oh, I wonder if that's going to hold true when I go outside in nature, right? You still want to verify these things, but it's a very nice intermediate tool. So just to drive home that point, what's the key word from this slide? Scale. Very good. Very good. And then if you think about what makes an ecosystem function, right? This is my favorite ecosystem. You guys remember these stamps?
Yes.
I love this one. You've got the water, which is critical, right? You've got the energy, and trying to figure out whether that is going to lead to photosynthesis and provide energy that can be moved through the ecosystem, or is that energy coming in and evaporating all the water before it gets incorporated and nothing can grow there, right? And then you've got all the different elements that are cycled. And it's not just carbon, you've got nitrogen, phosphorus, magnesium, etc. But those are sort of the big three, right? Water, energy, and carbon. And so these are the kinds of things that we can look at in detail, but in complex systems at large scales. So here's a picture of our rainforest. If you look at what it is trying to help us understand, it's not a small part of the world, right? This is the map of the US superimposed on top of the Amazon basin. That's a big chunk of the Earth's land surface, right? So losing that to deforestation and fires is going to have impacts around the world. And there's some scary predictions about sort of the internal causality of weather patterns in the Amazon. If you don't have the vegetation and the evaporation and the condensation of the rainfall, if you get rid of part of that cycle, you can't get it back, right? So if you get rid of the forest, then there's nothing to create clouds to cause rainfall. And so you can't get the rain patterns back in the same way that they were before. Some of the things that we have been able to observe in this forest are plateaus in the rate of uptake of things like carbon dioxide or the available light. So the machinery for photosynthesis gets maxed out at a certain level. And so this little figure is light intensity and rate of photosynthesis. You can see that there's an increase in rate of photosynthesis as you go from a little light to a medium amount of light, but with more light, the leaf can't do anything with it, right? The same is true for carbon dioxide, which is the source of the carbon that becomes a sugar that eventually becomes fossil fuels if you leave it long enough. Okay? And we've been able to take that forest of Biosphere 2 and crank up the CO2 to 600 parts per million, 800 parts per million, and observe this pattern. The other challenge is that if you do that at high temperature, these plants also produce something called isoprenes, which are protective to DNA and proteins, which is a good thing, but they also volatilize, and they themselves are greenhouse gases. So if you just predicted based on what you knew from, say, 200 or 400 ppm, you'd think, we're okay. The plants will just keep taking up CO2 as we put it in the atmosphere, right? But they don't. And at high temperatures, they're also creating their own chemicals that are themselves greenhouse gases, right? So you predict this sort of tipping point that maybe we'll get to at about 600 ppm. I hope we turn things around before then. All right, one of the key things that we're studying now in the rainforest, and you'll learn a lot more about this from Laura if you come to her talk later this fall, is the role of the soil and all those microbes and what's going on with the roots and the microbes. It's much more complex than we originally thought. It's this soil that really drove that change in oxygen concentration inside Biosphere 2 in the 90s. And this is Laura Meredith and some of her team. This whole fall, she has a huge group out at Biosphere 2, basically sticking tubes in everything, whether it's in the ground or above ground at Biosphere 2, so they can measure what happens under different temperature, drought, and CO2 regimes. And it's so sophisticated because if you remember any of your biochemistry, right, in photosynthesis, carbon dioxide eventually becomes a 6-carbon sugar. And when those sugars are breaking down in order to get the energy out of those bonds, the first step is to break it into 2 pyruvates, each of them with 3 carbons. And we now have the technology that we can label each of the carbons of the pyruvate separately. And so you can inject this labeled pyruvate into the system wherever you want, in the soil, in the leaves, in the stems, and then you can watch and see where the carbon goes, and then you can understand a lot more about the biochemistry that's going on inside the organisms, inside the plants.
That's crazy.
So she will tell you all about that if you come back. It's absolutely fascinating. There's like $2 million worth of equipment that got shipped over from Europe in order to be able to do these measurements. All right, in addition to the rainforest, the second story that I quickly want to tell you about is just this ocean idea that we are now going to tackle understanding why the oceans are losing corals. And we have a new research director as of about a year ago, Diane Thompson, and she is putting together a whole plan to reintroduce corals to Biosphere 2 and then make the system look like 2030, 2040, 2050 and see how the corals do. Because right now we're in trouble, right? We are losing corals not because of acidity so much, but because of elevated temperatures. And the increase in temperature is killing off the corals. And if you look around the world, coral reefs are providing a protein source, sort of an immediate protein source for like 1 billion people. It's also protecting coastlines from storm impacts. And it's also the fisheries recruitment ground for a whole bunch of things that then get fished out in the open ocean that are then things that we eat or that are fed to the chicken that we eat or become pet food, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of neat activity here that she will tell you about. And some of it includes trying to keep the algae concentration down. So we've done some fun introductions of hermit crabs and things. And so the ocean we have is not, it's kind of like one of these slightly broken systems out in space, right? It works, it's got the right components, but it's not complete. And so one of the things that's done really, really well for 30 years in our ocean is algae. Algae just goes nuts. And so the people living inside, somebody spent a couple hours every day cleaning algae out of the scrubber system in order to basically take it out and take the nutrients out. We still have the same problem, and so introducing things that eat algae is part of our solution. The third mini story I want to tell you is about the Landscape Evolution Observatory. This is why the U of A is at Biosphere 2. So the U of A was asked, do you want Biosphere 2? And the U of A said, maybe. And then got a bunch of scientists together who said, you know what? Because of the control and scale, we can ask and answer some questions that we can't do anywhere else. And we can bring together soil scientists, hydrologists, atmospheric scientists, microbial ecologists, plant ecologists, I mean, you name it. And all these people are working together. You know how hard it is to get all those people to work together? It takes a few years to get them to come up with a plan. But this is what they came up with, was 3 hill slopes in that half-acre farm area with crushed volcanic rock, and then they add water to that system and they see how it changes over time, right? It's not too different from trying to understand in detail what happens in Hawaii after volcano a volcano erupts, and then 50 years later you have plant life on it, right? Every time you add water, there's physical weathering and there's chemical weathering, there's carbon sequestration, the microbial community changes. It's really pretty fascinating. And we're to the point now, after about 3 years of data collection, where we're going to sort of put all this information together from 100+ different scientific papers and sort of try to tell the story of what we learned so far. And then we're going to put plants in the system. There are no plants in the system yet. It's just been water and rock and microbes that have found their way there. Each of these slopes has about 1,800 sensors buried in it, so you can measure the dickens out of it. The understory of each of these slopes looks something like this, a 10-degree slope. It's 1 meter deep by 11 meters wide by 30 meters long. And you can always take a good picture with a fisheye lens, right? Scale and control. The other thing that the U of A said when they were asked about this was, yeah, I think there's something we can do there, but we don't have any money. And so that's when we were able to get Ed Bass to give us that $3 to $4 million a year for 10 years. Initially, we asked for an endowment that would kick off that much, and he looked at the return that the U of A Foundation was getting, and he said, I can manage that money a lot better than the U of A Foundation. Why don't I just give you money every year? Right. All right, here's your quiz before we go on to the rest. And if I need to stop, let me know, okay? Because it is getting 6:53. Nobody's passed out yet, but we're close. These are your choices.
All of it.
Okay. Erin is a holistic thinker. Her answer is all of it, which is true, right? You can put T-Rex on the list, asteroids.
Right.
We basically are all stardust, right? Most immediately, though, most recently, where does the carbon in your salad come from?
Yeah.
Synthesis with air.
Air, exactly, right? And so you're an educated audience, and you get this, right? But a lot of people are like, what? It doesn't come out of the ground? So if you grow a tree in a pot, and you very, very carefully measure the mass of the soil, and then put a seedling in there, and then let it grow for 20, 30 years, and then take the tree out of there and measure the mass of the soil, it's changed by less than 0.5%. It doesn't change. But you just had a big tree grow out of that soil. It's because it's pulling the carbon dioxide out of the air and it's making stuff out of that carbon. So yes, you guys pass. You get your salad. And the reason I bring that up is because one of the ways that we connect our science to people is through food, right? Who doesn't eat or think about food? Right? I do both too often. We have some partnerships with folks like the Controlled Environment Ag Center. This is a NASA-funded replica of something that you might put under the soil of a moon or on Mars, where you would then grow. NASA wants to be able to grow 20 different food crops, right? For the nutrition, but also for the oxygen, the water cleaning, and the psychological benefit of green stuff. There's actually a lot of documented evidence of the value there. And it's a good way to get people excited, including kids. So the last mini story I want to tell you, and then I probably won't tell you about the education stuff, but let me wrap up with a project we call agrivoltaics. So this is a faculty member in geography, who got his PhD in ecology. He does research at Biosphere 2 and a bunch of other places. This is him on top of an eddy flux tower on on Bigelow, on Mount Bigelow,
Yeah.
up in the Catalina. And basically an eddy flux tower measures the respiration of an ecosystem because it's measuring humidity, wind, temperature, carbon dioxide, oxygen, and so you can understand how ecosystems work and breathe. And he just had a really fabulous paper come out 2 days ago that was submitted a year ago. And so if you've ever published a paper, right, there can be a long lag time between when you submit and then how many revisions you have to do before it gets accepted. So agrivoltaics works at this food, energy, water nexus. The idea is co-locating energy production from solar panels with food production. Right? And this started because Greg was asked by somebody, is a solar installation going to cause a heat island effect in our neighborhood if we put it next to our neighborhood? And the data say yes. Up to about 100 yards out, you can detect a temperature increase if you have a big solar installation where what you've done is basically blade and flatten the desert and just put in solar panels. Okay? And so Greg, being a plant physiologist, thought, well, let's see if we can mitigate that. Let's actually put some grass under there and see if the transpiration, so every time a leaf is bringing in CO2 to do photosynthesis, it's also losing water to the atmosphere. Okay? And so that water loss, that evaporation, takes heat out of that system. And so if you put plants under the solar panels, it gets rid of that heat island effect. It also makes the panels more efficient, because solar panels actually are more efficient when they're cooler than when they're hot, which kind of is unfortunate for my roof, which is whiter than it was before.
It's cool.
So it is a little bit cooler. Actually, I don't have thermometers on the actual panels. The panels might be warmer if there's more energy reflected up to them, but I don't know that. So this is sort of the storyline that I try and think about when I'm trying to connect some of the stuff that we do at Biosphere 2 that can be a little bit sort of complicated to things that people understand and care about, right? Everybody needs water, food, and energy. And these things are all sort of interdependent. In order to grow food, you need water and energy, right? To get it to you is energy, to fertilize it, to plant it, pick it, grow it, all those kinds of things. Wouldn't it be great if that was sort of how life was right now? But the idea is that by putting the plants underneath there, you are able to reduce the temperature of the panels, making them more efficient. But there's also a benefit from the panels to the plants. The plants are now less stressed by the environment, both on the hot end and the cold end. So they're not as heat stressed in the hottest part of the day because they're not getting as much direct sunlight. There's still plenty of sunlight around for photosynthesis. And in the winter, this serves kind of like cloud cover, right? It keeps the cold temperature from being as cold as it is when you're not under the panels. And so you get plant survivorship increasing. So I've got, let's look just at the bottom two pictures, okay? One of those is plants grown under solar panels, and one of them is plants not grown under solar panels. Which one is which, do you think?
The left is solar panels.
The left is under the solar panels. The plants do much, much better. And one of the other things is that there's a water conservation aspect to this. So if you look at this figure, these are data from this research. The blue is the amount of soil moisture in the soil underneath the solar panels, in the agrivoltaic setup, right? So you can see that it goes up when it gets watered, and it doesn't drop as low as the red, which is the soil that's out in the open sun, okay? So you retain more moisture in the soil. How ironic is that? My mom is calling. She says, you have to stop talking now. They've grown different food crops, chiltepines, jalapenos, tomatoes, and this is daily water use efficiency. So how much carbon dioxide is incorporated into the plant per amount of water? Which plant doesn't seem to care whether it's under the panels or not? The chiltepines, right? But the jalapenos and the tomatoes, much, much higher water use efficiency than when they're out in the open sun, okay? And then you can measure this sort of a different way, total fruit production. And now, the jalapeno basically produces the same amount of fruits, whether it's in the sun or under the panels, but it's going to be more water use efficient under the panels, right? The tomato is producing more fruit and at a water savings, because both of those figures are in that direction for tomatoes. And then the chiltepine, even though it's not more efficient, it produces a heck of a lot more peppers when it's under the panels. These are really cool data, and it's a system that people get, right? They understand. Agrivoltaics, open sun. If you just look at the graph on the top right, okay? You've got those squigglies going up and down. That is the daily variation in temperature of the solar panels. Guess which data have plants under them, blue or gray?
Blue.
Blue has the plants under it, right? the thermal gradient or the thermal variation is dampened by having plants underneath there. Okay? So the panels don't get as hot in the day, and they don't get as cold at night. And so with the blue panels, those are producing more energy, up to 6% more energy from panels that have plants under them than panels that don't. And if you scale that up, that's a big deal, right? That's a lot of energy. And I will stop on this slide because it gets into some of the education stuff that I spend a lot of my time on. But in addition to his site at Biosphere 2, Greg has a site at Monzo Elementary, which is in Barrio Hollywood, just west of downtown. And he's got a site at Rincon University High School. And he's got students collecting data. He's got students excited about math and science because now they get to do something that matters. It's not a worksheet, right? And it's also cool because nobody knows the answer yet, right? That's what science is. Science is not something where we know the answer. If you're doing something in your science class where the answer is known, then why are you wasting your time, right? These kids are able to grow and sell the things that they grow. And you know how much you can sell a quart jar of chiltepines for? It's like $80. So all the chiltepines that they grow are being bought by Downtown Kitchen and Cocktails and other local restaurants, which is absolutely fabulous. And the money goes back into the infrastructure for the school, for the science, and for the education. So that's the kind of really cool synergistic, not just science, but science and people, science and education. And that's the part that I get personally super excited about. And I'd be happy to talk more about that sometime. But over the rest of the fall, you'll learn more about the science. All those folks care about education too. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kevin.